Sir, this section is for first-class passengers only. The sentence struck like a slap wrapped in velvet, leaving a mark deeper than any insult could. Adrian Blake froze in the aisle. He hadn't even sat down yet before being stopped. The gold-plated sign above clearly read, First Class, Sky Vista Airlines. The ticket in his hand said the same. 2A, window seat, first row. But the woman standing before him, Tessa Morgan, navy blue uniform, spotless white gloves, lips pressed into the shape of a full stop, looked at him as though he had just stepped into a place where he did not belong. The cabin lights glinted off his deep blue suit and polished leather shoes. But Tessa's gaze didn't stop there. It swept over him, measured, weighed, and settled on his face, where his calm composure only deepened her. Suspicion. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Her voice pressed on the word please, as if it were a test. Adrian exhaled softly. He reached for his ticket with the deliberate calm of a man who had lived through this scene too many times before. Different airport, same wound. Tessa examined the ticket longer than necessary. Her eyes flickered when she read the name. Adrian Blake. Something flashed across her face. Surprise, maybe fear. Then vanished. "This is correct," she said, her tone tightening. "You may proceed." He didn't thank her, didn't nod. He simply walked down the red-carpeted aisle, each step reclaiming a fragment of the space taken from him by their gazes. The passengers in the cabin were already seated. A middle-aged couple in designer leisure wear, a silver-haired businessman reviewing spreadsheets on a tablet, an elegant woman flipping through Harper's Bazaar. No one spoke, but their eyes followed him like polite cameras. Polite, yet cold. Adrian set his caramel leather briefcase on the seat beside him and sat in 2A. The Italian leather was soft and cool. He didn't look around. His eyes stayed on the window, where the sunset painted the sky in the color of wine spilled on silk. Behind him, Tessa still stood there. She whispered something to her colleague, who nodded and slipped behind the curtain separating the cabin. The air shifted. Adrian knew the second act was about to begin. When she returned, holding a small notebook and a practiced smile, he wasn't surprised. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I'll need to verify your ID with your boarding pass." Adrian turned his head slowly, the corner of his mouth lifting into a tired smile. "Again?" "Routine check," she replied quickly, though her eyes hesitated. He looked straight at her, not angry, not condescending. Just the look of a man too accustomed to being judged by the color of his skin rather than the balance of his accounts. And in that instant, he understood. This flight would not only take him across the Atlantic, it would carry an entire empire against the headwinds of prejudice. The air inside the cabin felt thick, as if the flight hadn't taken off, but the tension already had. Tessa stood exactly 3 steps away from seat 2A, the small notebook trembling slightly in her hand, despite the polished smile she wore. "For safety reasons, I'll have to ask you to place your briefcase in the overhead compartment, Mr. Blake." Her voice was smooth, even, like a line recited from memory. Adrian looked up. "It fits under the seat," he replied calmly. "And it contains sensitive documents. I prefer to keep it within reach." Tessa kept that same practiced smile, the kind trained to never betray what's real. I'm afraid I'll have to insist, for compliance purposes. The moment stretched tight, like a string about to snap. A few passengers began to glance over. The silver-haired man shook his head faintly. The woman with the magazine raised its cover to her face in feigned disinterest. But every gaze, every single one, was watching. Adrian looked at her, then at the briefcase, then back into her eyes. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you're making a scene." Tessa pressed her lips together, her voice smoother but colder. "No, sir. I'm ensuring safety and compliance." Without another word, Adrian rose to his feet. There was no rush, no anger. Every movement was deliberate. The way he grasped the handle, opened the compartment, placed the case inside, and closed it with a sharp, precise click. A small sound, but in the still cabin, it landed like a gavel striking wood. When he sat back down, Tessa took a step back. The air thickened. He kept his composure, but deep inside, something began to burn. Not anger, but memory. The random security checks. The doors that accidentally didn't open. The looks that didn't mean anything, but said everything. 20 minutes before takeoff. Then another voice broke through, male, deep, firm. "Mr. Blake, the captain would like to speak with you for a moment." Adrian turned. A man in a black suit, Owen Clark, the chief purser, stood by the aisle. "Why?" Adrian asked, his tone calm but heavy enough to make the passengers in front turn their heads. "Just a quick clarification, sir. If you'd kindly step forward." Adrian buttoned his jacket and stood. He could feel the weight of every eye on his back as he walked down the narrow aisle. The silver-haired man watched him go, his expression filled with a strange sympathy. The kind of look from someone who had seen this before, but never dared to intervene. Inside the small galley near the cockpit, Captain Douglas Reed was waiting. 61 years old, a face carved by time, and a smile thin as a blade. "Mr. Blake," he began, "we've received a report of passenger misconduct, refusal to follow crew instructions." Adrian stood tall, his shoulders seeming to fill the narrow space. "Misconduct," he repeated, voice cold. "Because I placed a briefcase where it always fits. Sir, we need to maintain peace for all passengers. We'll have to ask you to deplane." The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. Adrian looked straight into the captain's eyes. "You're removing me based on a lie." Reed avoided his gaze and repeated mechanically, "It's for everyone's comfort and safety." Adrian let out a short, soundless laugh. "Comfort," he echoed. "You mean theirs? The comfort of watching a black man disappear from a seat he paid for?" No one answered. No one dared. He straightened his tie and lifted his chin. "Then remember this moment," he said slowly, "because you've just made the worst mistake of your careers." Then he turned away. No shouting, no outburst, only footsteps, steady, deliberate, and echoing like hammers against the carpeted floor. With each step, he left behind a cabin full of silence, not the silence of peace, but of shame. And within that silence, Adrian Blake walked out of the sky, preparing to buy the very airline that had just thrown him out. Night fell slowly over Manhattan. a black velvet curtain draping itself over towers of glass and steel. In the highest suite of the Carroll Grand Hotel, the golden light spilled across the calm, unreadable face of Adrian Blake. He stood before a wall of glass, staring out at the city, where the flow of cars below looked like veins of light pulsing through the body of power itself. On the table, a glass of scotch sat untouched. Beside it, a folded plane ticket, evidence of a wound no one could see. He said nothing, just stood there, still and silent. Then the sound of the door opening broke the quiet. Maya Chen entered, her heels clicking lightly against the wooden floor. Olive, green suit, hair tied neatly back, tablet in hand. Her eyes carried a hint of concern, but her voice remained humble. "You couldn't sleep?" Adrian shook his head gently. "No, I don't need sleep. I need clarity." She set the tablet down and studied him carefully. "I watched the footage from the airport. A passenger recorded everything. If you want, we can sue Sky Vista for discrimination. The media will side with you." Adrian turned, his gaze cold but precise. "No, Maya, I don't want to sue." "Then what do you want?" He lifted his eyes toward the window, where the night sky reflected the city's light into 1,000 fragments. "I want to buy them." She blinked, unsure if she heard correctly. "You're serious?" "Very." Adrian stepped closer to the table, his voice low and deliberate, each word landing like steel striking steel. "People think justice is loud, but real justice is organized silence. I don't need a headline on CNN. I need them to lose everything, without understanding why." Maya sat down, tapping her finger against the table in thought. She recognized that look, the look of someone who had been underestimated and had learned to retaliate with precision. "So what's the plan?" Adrian answered without pause. "Orias Group, Sky Vista's parent company. I want control." She opened her tablet, scrolling through data. Orias is a UK conglomerate listed in London. They're shielded by cross-holdings, sovereign funds, old European families. It won't be easy. Adrian smiled faintly. If it were easy, it wouldn't be worth it. He walked back toward the window, hands clasped behind his back, the stance of a man who had stopped being a victim. "Tomorrow, I want a list of every shell company we have, the ones no one remembers. Activate them, quietly." Maya looked up at him and nodded slowly. "You're not seeking revenge, are you?" Adrian turned, his eyes deep, impossible to read. "No, Maya. Revenge is emotional. This is structural correction. I don't want them to suffer. I want them to change." Outside, thunder rolled softly over Manhattan. The lights of the skyline flickered like signals beginning a hunt. Inside the room, neither spoke again. Only the whisper of the wind against the curtains and the faint hum of a war being planned, not with bullets, but with shares. Morning broke over Manhattan with the sound of horns and sunlight glinting off the glass towers. But on the 48th floor of Blake Strategic Holdings, no one mentioned the weather. Up there, a financial war was beginning, in silence. The conference room was walled with frosted glass, black leather chairs arranged in a perfect arc. On the table lay stacks of documents, each bearing the name of a shell company: Ardent Capital, Helix Trade, Morrow investments, small, seemingly insignificant fragments, but in Adrian Blake's hands, they were legal artillery. Maya Chen opened the meeting in a steady, low voice. We have 11 entities in Singapore and Dublin, 2 in Luxembourg. If we activate them simultaneously, within 72 hours we can trigger a buying chain without crossing disclosure thresholds. How much of Oria's stock can we quietly accumulate? Adrian asked, his eyes fixed on the ownership chart projected on the screen. Roughly 17% in the initial phase, Maya replied. Tiny fragments, nothing alarming. But to synchronize the process, we need a regulator, someone disciplined, incorruptible. And there's only one man I trust with that. Adrian didn't ask the name. He already knew. Call Victor Alvarez. 3 hours later, the door opened. Victor entered, dark grey suit, salt, and pepper hair, eyes sharp and unreadable. A former prosecutor who resigned because he refused to compromise. He looked at Adrian for a long moment before speaking. I heard you got kicked off a plane. Adrian nodded slightly. News travels faster than I expected. The whole world saw the video. A black executive pulled out of first class for not fitting the image. What's your move? Lawsuit? No, Adrian said, his voice steady as steel. I'm going to buy the airline. Victor paused, then let out a dry laugh. You're insane. They're the 4th largest carrier in Europe, backed by sovereign wealth funds, protected by private banks. What are you going to fight them with? Adrian sat, fingers interlocked. With time and precision. Maya tapped the screen, revealing the shareholder map of ORIOS, hundreds of connections weaving together like a spider's web. No one ever strikes the center. But if we pull one thread at a time, 0.5% here, a fraction there, the web collapses on its own. Victor folded his arms, eyes narrowing. You're not trying to destroy them. You're trying to take them. There's a difference. Exactly, Adrian said. I'm not burning the forest. I'm changing who runs it. Silence lingered for a beat. Then Victor leaned back in his chair. I'll help. But on one condition, everything stays clean. No laundering, no shadow trading, no cyber attacks. Adrian nodded once. I don't need to get my hands dirty. They'll do that for me. Afternoon light flooded through the glass, catching Adrian's face, calm, composed. But behind his eyes, the operation had already begun. Victor spoke quietly, almost like a warning. You know this isn't a deal anymore, right? It's a siege. Adrian smiled faintly. And the best sieges, he said, make no noise at all. The room fell silent. The hum of the air conditioning merged with the faint tapping of Maya's fingers against the table. The first rhythm of Project Spectre. A war with no soldiers, no weapons, only precision, intelligence, and a man once underestimated, now preparing to buy the very sky that had rejected him. There were no drums, no declarations. Project Spectre began in absolute silence, like a ghost slipping across the invisible borders of global finance. 36 hours after the meeting in Manhattan, small buy orders started appearing on the London Stock Exchange. Each order represented barely 0.3% of all IUS Group's stock, placed by obscure companies with names that sounded like a joke, Northwind Trading, Aegis Maritime, Marlowe Partners. No one paid attention, because no one ever fears the wave that starts as 100 drops. On the 48th floor, Adrian Blake and Maya Chen monitored the streaming data across a massive screen. Rows of glowing green numbers rising and falling like the steady pulse of a living organism awakening from sleep. "No one suspicious?" Adrian asked, his voice calm, the steady rhythm of a man orchestrating tension. "No," Maya replied, eyes locked on the graph. "Every transaction is below the reporting threshold. We're just a whisper in the market's noise." Adrian smiled faintly. "Good. The quieter it is, the deeper it cuts." Across the Atlantic, Victor Alvarez worked inside a narrow, windowless room, illuminated only by the cold light of his monitors. Speaking through a secure line to advisors in Luxembourg and Singapore, his tone was steady. "We don't buy fast," he said. "We buy consistently, like a needle falling into water, no sound, no ripples." Every share was logged in a confidential ledger under its own encrypted code. Each fragment, insignificant on its own, was slowly assembling into invisible power. But Adrian knew money alone wouldn't win this. He needed doubt. A corporation only trembles when the market's trust begins to fracture. And Maya was the one to plant that seed. In a dim-lit room in Soho, she met with an independent finance blogger, the kind who could smell fire through smoke. "You don't need to know who I am," Maya said softly, her voice sharp as glass. "Just publish what I send you." The file she handed over contained real information, just stripped of its context. A few edited maintenance reports, a handful of emails about delayed approvals, and one bold headline suggestion: Sky Vista Airlines facing maintenance irregularities. 2 days later, the blog posted the article. A small newspaper picked it up. A week after that, The Guardian ran a feature: The Slow Death of a British Icon. The market shivered. Orias Group's stock slipped 4.3% in 4 days. No panic. Not yet. But inside the polished offices of Mayfair, private meetings began sprouting like mushrooms after rain. There, Sir Philip Ashford, chairman of Or I Us, sipped his Earl Grey with calm arrogance. "Rumours don't kill corporations," he said. "We've survived oil crises, Brexit, trade wars. A tabloid blog means nothing." But as he spoke, 17% of Or I Us shares had quietly changed hands. No noise, no trace. Just green lines of data no one bothered to read closely. In Manhattan, Maya placed the latest report on Adrian's desk. "We've passed 17%. He nodded slowly, voice low and deliberate. "Begin phase 2. Increase speed when London opens." "And the media strategy?" she asked. "Just enough for them to believe the problem is inside their own walls, not outside." That night, Maya sent out 2 more leaks: an internal memo on pilot pay adjustments and a technical report on transatlantic route inefficiencies. Both were real, just out of time. 2 days later, the Financial Times headlined, "Why is Or I Us Group so quiet lately?" None of the articles mentioned Adrian, none linked back to America. But every line was a stone thrown at the glass wall of confidence. On the London trading floor, Or I Us shares fell another 6%. A major pension fund offloaded its 6% stake. And as if destiny had planned it, one of Adrian's shell companies was already there, waiting to catch it. A single mouse click, soundless. But on the 48th floor in Manhattan, Project Spectre officially crossed 25% control. No one knew. No one suspected. And in that darkness, Adrian Blake sat still. The light from the monitor glinting in his eyes, the reflection of an Emma collapsing, without realizing it had already begun to fall. A grey morning settled over Mayfair, London. On Berkeley Street, a line of Bentleys idled in front of the glass tower of Aureus Group. Reporters waited outside, cameras aimed at the revolving doors. The most prestigious airline conglomerate in Britain was about to hold its annual shareholders' meeting. But no one knew that today its empire would quietly change hands. Inside, the grand hall glowed under golden light. In the front row, Sir Philip Ashford, 6 years old, dressed in a tailored brown suit and deep red tie, stepped up to the podium. Once hailed as the man who held Britain's skies, his voice carried a practiced calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, Aureus has weathered many storms, but the strength of tradition will always keep us steady." The audience listened in silence. The pride of the old aristocracy hung in the air, delicate yet suffocating. No one noticed the man seated in the very last row, Adrian Blake, wearing a charcoal suit, no tie. He didn't need attention. He only needed the right moment. Beside him, Maya Chen's fingers moved swiftly over her laptop. "We've reached the threshold," she whispered. 38.4% consolidated shares. Adrian nodded slightly, expression unreadable. On stage, Sir Philip began the next item on the agenda: board re-election. But before he could continue, a legal representative stood up, holding a thick file. "Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the newly consolidated shareholder group, we move to add an immediate motion, a vote to replace the chairman of the board, supported by a controlling interest exceeding 38%. A ripple of whispers tore through the room. Sir Philip froze, his expression stiffening. "I would like confirmation. Who brings forth this motion?" The representative opened the document and read aloud, his voice firm and clear. "Filed on behalf of the shareholders, represented by Blake Strategic Holdings and its affiliated entities, Northwind Trading, Ardent Capital, Morrow Investments." Names that once seemed meaningless now formed a perfect web. Sir Philip turned the page, stopping at one name printed in bold: Adrian R. Blake. The atmosphere shifted instantly, as though a shadow had swept across the crystal chandeliers, dimming their glow. He looked toward the back of the room. The man there, the one he had once met years ago at a conference in Geneva, was now looking back at him, eyes calm, steady, like the surface of a lake before a storm. Memories returned. Back then, Adrian had delivered a passionate presentation on sustainable aviation fuel, full of vision, full of conviction. But Sir Philip hadn't listened. He had simply smiled and whispered to a colleague, "We don't need people like him teaching us about innovation." And now that very man, that outsider, stood owning the skies he had been excluded from. "Mr. Blake," Sir Philip's voice trembled slightly, "is this some kind of joke?" Adrian rose. No theatrics, no fanfare. Just a man walking to the center of the room, the man who had just purchased the very sky that once threw him to the ground. He placed his hand on the microphone. "No, Sir Philip, this isn't a joke. This is justice. It just happens to wear a suit instead of a robe." The room fell utterly silent. Adrian's gaze swept across the crowd, faces of those who had once thought of him as an outsider. "Power," he said slowly, voice low and commanding, "doesn't need to shout. It moves quietly, like dignity. But humiliation makes noise. It echoes, and when ignored, it grows teeth." No one moved. Then one by one, phones lit up. News alerts flashed across international financial networks. U.S. investor Adrian Blake quietly acquires British aviation giant Aureus Group. Cameras clicked, flashes igniting like small explosions. Sir Philip lowered his head, hands trembling. An entire generation of old power collapsed before it could even catch its breath. Adrian didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked away. The echo of his footsteps on the marble floor sounded like the gavel strikes marking the end of an era. Beside him, Maya whispered, "You've won." Adrian's eyes stayed fixed on the glass doors ahead, where the grey London sky was slowly breaking into light. "Not yet," he said softly. "I've only reclaimed my seat. The sky still owes a debt." As he stepped out of the boardroom, the mirrored walls reflected his figure, the silhouette of a new kind of power, one that did not shout, did not rage, but was strong enough to make the heavens bow. London, a week after the takeover. News about the quietest acquisition of the century still flooded the financial channels. The press dubbed Adrian Blake the Phantom CEO, the man who bought back the empire that had humiliated him without saying a word. He didn't care about the headlines. What kept him awake was a woman in a navy uniform. Now that Aureus was under his control, every door that had slammed shut in his face was opening. Adrian dove into the company's internal archive. Thousands of emails, reports, crew manifests. The screen glowed with cold blue light, and then a line made his heart stop. Route 407 crew change request. Approve. Rebecca Morgan. Note: discreet monitoring advised. Requested by Harold Morgan. 2 Morgans, same name, father and daughter, and Harold was Aureus's director of flight operations. Not a coincidence, not a routine, but a plan. The next morning at Terminal 5, Heathrow, the crew lounge was still quiet, flight boards flashing white letters on green. In a corner, Tessa Morgan checked her staff pass and smoothed her hair in the metal vending machine mirror, neat, composed, immaculate in navy. The automatic doors sighed open, and footsteps sounded behind her. She froze. Adrian Blake stood there, charcoal overcoat, tall, silent as a shadow. Their eyes met. For a moment, she could not believe it. Her voice came out slightly shaky, steadying itself. "Blake, I didn't expect to see you here." Adrian stepped forward, his tone low and precise. "Did you think I'd be too busy running your father's company to speak?" Color drained from Tessa's face. I don't understand what you mean." "You do," he said evenly. "I know who you are. I know what your father did. And I know why you were on that flight." The room went quiet, except for the faint tick of a clock. Tessa swallowed, her eyes shifting. "It wasn't what you think," she whispered. I was instructed to monitor, only to observe. They told me you were a potential risk. I didn't mean to hurt you. Monitor? Adrian stepped closer, his gaze ice. Cold. Monitor by humiliating someone in front of the whole cabin? That's the procedure. I was following protocol, she insisted. He cut her off, voice firm yet like a blade through the air. No, you followed your father's legacy. A legacy built on making people who don't look like the passengers he prefers into a problem. Tessa lowered her head, fingers clenching the name badge. What do you want from me? Adrian was silent for a long beat, then spoke slowly, each word clear. I don't want you fired. I want you to stay. She looked up, startled. Stay. For what? To witness, he said, never taking his eyes off her. I want you to fly under the new policies, wear the new uniform, serve the passengers your father once deemed not image-worthy. I want you to bow, to smile, and to hear them say, thank you, every day. Tears rose in her throat. Are you punishing me? She asked. No, he softened. I want you to learn. True remorse is not found in what you lose. It is found in what you see. He stepped back into the light from the door and left her with one final, steady instruction. Tell your father he should teach his child to see people, not passenger profiles. Then he walked away. No threats, no more words, leaving Tessa standing in a perfect uniform, while the world she knew quietly collapsed. 3 days later at Aurea's headquarters, Harold Morgan tendered his immediate resignation. No press conference, no farewell statements, just a cold internal email, effective immediately. And at Heathrow, Tessa kept flying, but not on international routes. Each time she rolled her suitcase past the aisle, her gaze lingered on seat 2A, as if she could still see the man who had once sat there, calm, silent, and more terrifying than any outburst of rage. Adrian no longer wanted revenge. He had completed the lesson, because sometimes the most powerful revenge is not to take something from someone, but to make them see themselves every single day. The skies over London were heavy with late October clouds, yet inside the headquarters of Aureus Group, the light was clear and sharp, like morning after a storm. 2 months had passed since Adrian Blake had taken control. The building that once overflowed with arrogance was now quiet, but alive. The signs reading restricted access had been removed. Doors once marked executives only now stood open to technicians, flight attendants, and engineers. And at the helm of Sky Vista Airlines was its new CEO, Aisha Khan, 40 years old, a former naval pilot who had flown through real storms and was now steering a vessel called Justice. Standing before the management team, her voice was strong, decisive. We once flew high on reputation, but from now on, we will fly right on integrity. No more vague policies, no more case-by-case exceptions. From this day forward, everyone will be served equally, without needing to prove they deserve it. In the audience, Maya Chen watched, smiling faintly. What had begun in Manhattan was now a reality. An empire changed from within. At the design hangar, new uniforms were being unveiled. Light blue blended with grey. Minimalist, gender, neutral, and rank. Free. On the lapel, a small silver pin bore the words, "Equity is our altitude." No slogan, no grand statement, just a promise simple and heavier than steel. At Heathrow Airport, banners lined the corridors reading, "Altitude belongs to everyone." Hundreds of passengers stopped to take photos, sharing them online with the hashtag @NewSkyVista. And in the first-class cabin of the relaunch flight from JFK to Heathrow, seat 2A was still there. But the passenger sitting in it today was not a businessman or a billionaire. It was Malik Davis, a 19-year-old freshman in aerospace engineering, the first recipient of the Coal Horizons Fund Scholarship, a program Adrian had established just 6 weeks earlier. Malik gazed out of the window, his eyes bright as the plane taxied for takeoff. He didn't know the whole story. He only knew that someone out there had believed in people like him, enough to give them a chance to touch the sky. In the cockpit, Captain Sofia Delgado, a young Latina pilot, adjusted her headset and spoke through the radio. "Sky Vista 417, ready for takeoff." Her voice was steady, confident, carrying the pride of a new generation. In the operations room in London, Adrian watched from a screen. He hadn't attended the ceremony, hadn't made a speech. "You should be there," Maya said softly beside him. He shook his head. "No, that's not my flight anymore. It belongs to them." The light from the screen glowed across his face, calm, thoughtful. "You've done what they said was impossible," Maya murmured. "You turned personal humiliation into corporate reform. You didn't just buy the sky. You repaired it." Adrian smiled faintly, eyes following the plane as it turned onto the runway. The engines roared, carrying new dreams upward into the clouds. In the cabin, Malik closed his eyes as the plane lifted off, feeling something he couldn't quite name, freedom without permission. On the tarmac below, another figure watched from a distance. Tessa Morgan. Preparing for her own domestic flight, she wore the new uniform, the same composed smile. But now, on her lapel, she too bore the silver pin. "Equity is our altitude." No one knew, but every time she passed through first class, her eyes paused for a moment on seat 2A, the place that had changed her life forever. In a New York newsroom, a journalist asked the company's media representative, "What changed Sky Vista so quickly?" Zoe Parker, the young black communications director, smiled gently. "There's no miracle," she said, "just one man who reminded us the sky doesn't belong to the strongest, but to those who know how to fly together." That night, as the city settled into silence, Adrian stood alone by the window of his high-rise office. He looked up at the deep, endless sky, where the lights of aircraft traced across the darkness like falling stars. Each one carried a story of someone once underestimated, once pushed from their seat. And now he understood. The greatest victory isn't reclaiming your seat. It's rebuilding the plane so that no one else ever loses theirs again. 4 months after Sky Vista's transformation, there were no ribbon cuttings, no headlines about historic reform, only a new kind of quiet, one that no longer came from fear, but from trust rebuilt. Inside Aureus Group's headquarters, the oil portraits of former chairmen had disappeared from the corridors. In their place hung black and white photographs of pilots, engineers, mechanics, and flight attendants. The people once forgotten beneath the clouds of prestige. Beneath each image, a simple line read, "Legacy isn't lineage, it's impact." On the 47th floor, Maya Chen now served as Chief Strategy Officer, the gatekeeper of transparency. Before her lay a long list of contracts, partners, and shareholder trusts. "Most of this system," she said, eyes fixed on the screen, "was built to hide where real power lies. I'm dismantling it, layer by layer." Adrian stood behind her, hands in his pockets, gazing out at the fog-draped London skyline. "Don't cut too deep, Maya," he said quietly. "Every structure still needs a spine." She smiled faintly. "Don't worry. I'm only cutting the excess, the parts where ethics were once for sale." She paused, looking up at him. "Do you think they realize this was personal?" Adrian slowly shook his head. "It never was, until they made it that way." Under Aisha Khan's leadership, Sky Vista had rewritten its entire internal policy. Any discrimination complaint now went directly to an independent ethics office, bypassing management. Monthly open forums were held, not just for executives, but for pilots, ground crews, and technicians alike. "We will not let fear become policy," Aisha declared during one meeting. "If they ever try to bury another Adrian Blake, they'll have to dig through me first." The room erupted in laughter, but within that laughter was respect. At JFK, Zoe Parker, now a boarding supervisor, was briefing a group of new flight attendants. Behind her, a large sign read, "Altitude belongs to everyone." An older passenger frowned. "Ms. Parker, don't you think you people talk about equality a little too much? I just want good service, not politics." Zoe smiled, her tone soft yet sharp enough to cut. "Good service starts with fairness, sir. We're simply expanding the definition of customer." Meanwhile, Tessa Morgan continued her quiet work. No one fired her, but no one promoted her either. She flew short routes, London to Lisbon, Edinburgh to Dublin. Always professional, always precise. And sometimes, amid the chatter of passengers, she heard someone say, "Thank you, Ms. Morgan." That alone was enough to tighten her chest. She knew she would never return to international flights, but every time she adjusted the silver pin on her uniform, she thought of Adrian's words. "I don't want you to lose your job. I want you to witness." Now every flight she took was a lesson in humanity. As for Adrian, he no longer occupied an executive chair. He didn't need to. The company now ran on the principles he had built: fairness, transparency, integrity. He attended only essential meetings, often arriving late and leaving early, always with the same parting line: "Don't look for me in profit reports. Look for me in how people are treated." Then the Coal Horizons Fund released its numbers. $120 million invested in students of aviation, engineering, and management, not just scholarships but flight hours, mentorship, and job placements. Adrian didn't call it charity. He called it a system of opportunity. One evening in a quiet restaurant in Canary Wharf, Victor Alvarez looked at him over dinner. "You really plan to step away from every role?" Adrian nodded. "Justice shouldn't have one face, Victor. It should have many." Victor chuckled softly. "Then you're a ghost now." "Maybe," Adrian replied, lifting his coffee cup. "But even ghosts can carry light, as long as they don't need a name." That night, he returned to his old suite at the Carril Grand. The same room where he had once vowed to buy back the sky. The room was unchanged, except for one thing. On the wall hung a framed photo of Sky Vista Flight 417, soaring above the clouds. Beneath it, a metal plaque read, "Bought once in humiliation, reclaimed in silence." Adrian stood there for a long moment, then turned off the light. The room fell into darkness, but he knew that below, hundreds of planes were still taking off, carrying people once deemed not good enough. And in that darkness, he smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won, but of one who had rebuilt fairness, brick by brick. Dawn rose slowly over the coast of Maine. The sun cut through the fog, its golden light gliding across silver waves that broke softly against the cliffs. Adrian Blake stood on the edge of the rocks, his long coat rippling in the wind, hair swept back. In his hand was an unsealed letter. Beside him stood Maya Chen, wrapped in a grey coat and a wool scarf, her eyes fixed on the vast horizon. "After everything?" she asked quietly. "What will you do now?" Adrian said nothing. He looked toward the horizon, where the sea and the sky merged into one endless expanse. After a long silence, his voice came, deep and distant, carried by the wind. "Now, I give it back to them." Before leaving Aureus Group, Adrian had spent one last night in his empty office. No more files, no more meetings, just the glass wall overlooking London's glittering lights. He walked down the corridor, fingers brushing against the photographs, faces he had never met, yet whose lives had changed because of the policies he built. A young female captain in Nairobi, a mechanical engineer in Mumbai, a student of African descent wearing a badge that read Coal Horizons Scholar. Each picture was an answer to a question that had haunted him for years. Did I really change anything, or was I just a more sophisticated avenger? Now he knew. No one remembered the day he was forced off a plane, but they remembered the day Sky Vista changed its slogan, and that was enough. The next morning, he sent an email to the board of directors. "Aureus is stable. I'm stepping back from daily operations, remaining only as an honorary advisor. The rest I leave to those who once had to buy a ticket just to be heard." There was no farewell party, no applause, just a man clearing his desk, folding his old handkerchief, and leaving behind a silver pin engraved with the words, "Equity is our altitude." A week later in London, Malik Davis, the young student who once sat in seat 2A, received a letter with no sender. Inside were just a few lines. "Take nothing for granted, but don't ask for permission either. They'll try to put you where they think you fit. When they do, stand taller, not to be seen, but to see further." There was no signature, but Malik knew. He folded the letter and slipped it into his wallet beside his new MIT scholarship card. At that same moment, at JFK, Zoe Parker was helping an elderly passenger board a plane. She smiled, her voice warm but firm. A reporter nearby asked, "What changed this airline so fast?" Zoe looked up, her smile reflecting the airport lights. "There's no miracle," she said. "Someone just reminded us that the sky never needed to be granted. It already belonged to everyone." Elsewhere in England, Tessa Morgan lived in a small apartment by the Cornwall coast. She had quietly left aviation. No scandal, No farewell, just silence. Every morning, as she opened her little seaside cafe, she still wore the silver pin. When regulars asked, "Is that from your old airline?" she simply smiled. "No, it's a reminder of the person I used to be." On a wooden shelf behind the counter, among white porcelain cups, sat a single photograph. A Sky Vista 417 aircraft climbing into the sunrise. At Aureus headquarters, the boardroom had changed too. No more high-backed chairs or golden nameplates. The old portrait of Sir Philip had been replaced by a simple painting, a blurred horizon between clouds. Beneath it, a plaque read, "New Horizons, founded 2025. At the head of the table stood Aisha Khan, leading her first meeting without Adrian. "We don't have a legacy anymore," she said. "We have a direction." Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering, as if Adrian's legacy had transformed into a compass guiding the next generation. That night in Maine, the ocean wind grew stronger. Adrian looked down at the letter in his hand once more. "You're not going to send it?" Maya asked. He smiled softly. "No need. The boy will understand, even without a signature." She looked at him, pride and melancholy mingling in her eyes. "You know, Adrian," she said quietly, "the world may never remember who you were, but it will live inside what you built." He nodded. "I don't need them to remember my name. I just need them to keep the principle." They stood in silence, listening to the waves crash against the cliffs. In the distance, the faint hum of jet engines echoed through the air. A Sky Vista plane crossed the horizon, its lights glinting across the sea. Adrian lifted his head, following the trail of light until it disappeared into the clouds. "That day," he said, "they threw me out of the sky. Now I know no one can push me down again, because I don't fly for myself anymore." Maya smiled, her eyes reflecting the dawn blooming on the horizon. "And now, it belongs to them." They turned, walking slowly down the narrow path toward the pine forest. Behind them, the waves kept breaking, the wind kept moving, and the eastern sky began to blush with pale pink light. A new day was beginning, a new era, where dignity needs no upgrade and fairness needs no permission. Adrian didn't look back. Because some stories aren't meant to close, they simply continue, like airplanes departing into the distance, leaving a trail of light for others to find their way. People often think justice sounds like thunder, a verdict crashing down loud enough for everyone to hear. But Adrian Blake proved the opposite, that sometimes justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be relentless. A man who was thrown out of first class for not fitting the image didn't choose to sue or strike back. He chose to change the system, not through outrage, but through strategy. Not through shouting, but through organized silence. And while the world searched for heroes who could roar, Adrian became the symbol of one who never needed applause, the man who quietly rebuilt the plane so that every passenger would have a seat. Now, at every Sky Vista boarding gate, a new slogan gleams in silver letters. Altitude belongs to everyone. Short, yet carrying within it a journey of tears, perseverance, and faith. The belief that dignity is not something to be earned, but something we are born with. From Tessa, the flight attendant who once failed, to Malik, the first scholar of the Coal Horizons Fund, to Aisha, the CEO who redefined legacy. Each carries a fragment of that story. A story not just about the sky, but about every place that once closed its doors to those who didn't fit the mold. If you've ever been underestimated, looked down upon, or pushed out of the seat 2A of your own life, remember this. Sometimes, instead of demanding fairness, you can rebuild the entire cabin. And when you do, quietly, steadily, with integrity, the world will have no choice but to look up. Like this video if you believe dignity needs no permission. Subscribe to help spread stories of resilience. And before you leave, write 3 words in the comments. I stand tall. Because that's what Adrian Blake taught the world, that even when you're thrown out of the sky, you can still buy it back with integrity.